Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you. I'm so excited to be here to be talking about polarization. But before I get on to polarization, I actually just wanted to share a little bit more about myself. If we can just go to the next slide. So I'm Alex Chesterfield. I'm a southerner with northern roots. So I grew up near Brighton, went to my local state schools, used to have a very strong Scouse accent, believe it or not. I'm married to Will, and I'm mum to Ted and Evie. So they're now 7 and 10, so a lot older than you can see in that photo. As you said at the beginning, I'm an applied behavioural scientist, and I'm also a formerly elected Conservative councillor and activist. So that picture at the bottom you can see on the slides is me back in 2010 canvassing on election day. I wasn't successful with my little blue rosette and blue balloon. So note how I have deliberately put things that I might have in common with people first before revealing things about myself that might trigger a more negative reaction. And on that note, some of the points in this session might make people feel a bit uncomfortable. Polarization is incredibly hard, complex, and messy. And the polarization that we talk about in the book is not at the extremes. So we're not dealing with extremes here. It's polarization in the relative mainstream. And when people typically think about polarization, they think about scenes like this. So they think about Trump, they think about America. But polarization involves these really natural processes that are happening much closer to home. So America isn't unusual. In fact, it's not even the place that has the worst levels of polarization currently. And it's often a problem in Europe too. So think about the Green Party in Germany, think about Orban in Hungary, think about Le Pen in France, think about Brexit in the UK. In pre-pandemic, a survey was done, and just over half of the UK population said they thought the UK was more divided than at any point in their lifetime. So the key message is that although most of the research that's been done on polarization is from the US, we have reason to be concerned much more widely. And another, another assumption that people often make about polarization is that when they think about it, they typically think about polarization around issues. So how far people are divided on a set of issues or a particular issue. So for example, gun control, abortion, climate change, etc. So the question has traditionally been, how far apart are those views? And that's what's known as issue polarization. But what that misses out is our identity. So identity is also a key part of this polarization picture or polarization problem. Now, identity is about who we are as individuals. So I describe myself at the beginning, as a mother, as a behavioural scientist, etc., as a southerner. So who we are as individuals is at least partly about the groups that we belong to. And our group identity, as I said, might be gender, they might be based in our nationality, they might be based in our political outlook. And what we're seeing is division around these group identities, which then, what we're seeing are these increasing levels of distrust and dislike of the other side, irrespective of whether or not people agree or disagree on particular issues. Now, this phenomena is known as affective polarization, where feelings become much more important than facts, and partisan labels. So think about words like anti-vaxxer, woke, Guardian reader, latte drinker, gammon, etc., come to act as proxies for differences in values and beliefs that go way beyond politics. And affective polarization will impact you. So even if you think it's not going to, it will impact you, your customers, your communities, your businesses. And there's some evidence suggesting it will impact you, especially if you think it isn't going to. Okay, let's talk now a bit more about the psychology behind this affective polarization. So as I said earlier, to recap, affective polarization has its roots in this idea of social identity. So the groups that we identify psychologically as belonging to or not, which might be social class, nationality, region, football team, etc. And humans love groups. So I think it was John Haidt, he's a professor at NYU, described the defining characteristic of humans as groupishness, as their groupishness. And for good reason. Groups bring us a bunch of benefits. So think back to our caveman days. Groups brought us safety, they brought us protection from wild animals, they helped us get food, they helped us find a mate. But as well as physical benefits, groups also bring really important psychological benefits. So think about the effects of not belonging to a group. So, it physically hurts not to belong. Think about loneliness, which is obviously a massive problem in the pandemic and continues to be. But belonging to a group also has benefits for our self-esteem. So it makes us feel good, especially think about when your team or your side wins, that makes us feel good. Now, the process for dividing the world into in-groups and out-groups has broadly 3 stages, so the ones that you can see at the bottom. So first of all, we categorise, so Northerner, Southerner, Conservative, Labour, progressive, Liberal, man, woman, etc., etc. And that happens quite automatically. Once we've adopted a particular group identity, and we typically have lots of them, we then sometimes adopt that identity visibly. So that might be, for example, my little blue rosette or blue balloon. It might be adopting an accent, so I quickly lost my Scouse accent growing up near Brighton. Or it might be wearing your football team shirt. And then once we've adopted the identity, we then compare our in-group to out-groups, and we like our group, in-group, to come out on top, because that's what gives us the self-esteem and makes us feel good. So when our group wins, it feels good. And the key message or the key point is that once we've identified with any group, that group will fundamentally shape our experience of the world. So our beliefs, our emotions, our perceptions, and our behaviours. And this cartoon you can see on the screen illustrates just how much our group identities shape our reality. So our blessed homeland versus their barbarous wastes. Our glorious leader versus their wicked despot. Our great religion versus their primitive superstition. You get the gist. And critically, once we have picked a side, it can heavily influence how we then behave towards both our in-group and that out-group, often without our awareness. And there's a great experiment from a professor called Mark Levine. So he was at University of Lancaster, and he did this experiment that illustrates this point beautifully. So he did an experiment with Manchester United fans. He got them into the lab. And the first part of the experiment, these Manchester United fans had to fill in a questionnaire that was designed to strengthen their team allegiance. Once they filled it in, they were then told that the second part of the experiment involved them walking to another university block. So off they trotted. And en route to the second university block, they saw a runner fall down in pain, so trip over and fall down in pain. Now that runner was actually a Confederate, so he was in on the experiment. And the question that Mark Levine and his team wanted to know or ask was, will people stop and help this runner crying out in pain on the floor? And the answer depended on what football shirt the runner was wearing. So when the runner was wearing a Manchester United shirt, which was obviously a fellow in-group member, 92% of participants stopped to help him. When, however, the poor guy on the floor was wearing a Liverpool shirt, so a rival football team or the out-group, or a neutral football shirt, only 30% of participants stopped to help him. So, key message, we like to put people in in-group and out-groups, and that then alters how we behave towards them. Okay, now what we're seeing more and more are these spillover effects. So where our in-groups and out-groups affect decisions way beyond the political realm. So for example, investment decisions. So there's evidence showing that fund managers are more likely to invest in companies managed by co-partisans, that consumers are twice as likely to engage in transactions when their partisanship matches that of the seller. There's evidence that it impacts treatment advice for politicised health issues like abortion or vaccines, not apolitical health issues like I've got a corn on my toe, but the more political health issues. And the list goes on. So it affects who we hire, who we marry, who we date, who we live with. Now, these spillover effects are only beginning to be studied outside the US, but they may be affecting many different areas of our lives. And I'm going to channel a bit of Michael Caine. The odds are that things are going to get worse before they get better. And the reason we make this argument in the book is that there's various factors, macro factors, let's call them, that have been identified that are associated with polarization. So they're likely to exacerbate this innate tendency we have for tribalism. So these factors include things like uncertainty, rising inequality, so the gap between rich and poor, rising unemployment, and more information. Now, all these factors are likely to go up in a post-pandemic world. And staying on the theme of macro factors, we often like to hold up social media as the poster boy for why different countries are currently so polarized. We're experiencing higher levels of polarization. But we make the argument in the book, it's far too simple to hold up social media as that poster boy. Now, what the research suggests is that social media typically mutes moderates and amplifies more polarizing positions. So this both distorts and reinforces perceptions. We also know that social media business models are designed to monetize negative and more emotional content. So, for example, they're the tweets that typically get more shared, they get more likes, they get retweeted. So it pays to polarize. So on that note, social media companies undoubtedly bear some responsibility, but they are certainly not responsible for all polarization, as if that was the case, we never would have been polarized before, which is definitely not the case. So being polarized kind of goes up and down. It's a state that there's always some level of polarization throughout history. So this is nothing new. And in 2016, the group that was most polarized in the US was actually the group that was offline. So just blaming social media underestimates the influence of more traditional news channels. So for example, think about Fox News in the US, think about radio here in the UK or local news. They also have a lot of influence on this polarization problem. Right, let's end on a more optimistic note. So what can we do about this? Now, the last third of the book talks about what we can do, so potential solutions. So what we can do as individuals, what we can do at a group level, and then what we can do at an institutional level. Given time now, I'm going to focus on two areas that you can start doing straight after you have watched all of Nudgestock. So the first one is to activate elements of your shared identity. So when you're in conversation with someone, say, for example, describe yourself as I'm a Londoner, not I'm a Remainer or I'm a Leaver. And let me take you back very quickly to that football experiment we talked about to illustrate the power of the common bond. So Mark Levine did a second experiment, so a replication and an extension. He kept everything the same as the first experiment apart from one small tweak. So this time, rather than asking Manchester United participants to fill in a questionnaire at the beginning about their love of Manchester United, he asked them to fill in questions about their love of the game, so football in general. And there was a huge effect of that tiny tweak. So what he saw when that poor runner was on the floor, this time, around the same proportion of Manchester United fans stopped to help their Manchester United fellow fan on the floor. But this time, they also stopped to help around 70% of Liverpool fans, so the out-group, or when someone was wearing a neutral football shirt. So key message, find common ground first, and that our identities are flexible, so they're not fixed, and we can leverage that inherent flexibility to build bridges. Okay, last one is use a trusted messenger to engage with other groups and frame messages in a way that appeals to the other side. And in the book, we tell the story of Lewis Lang, who was a lifelong Republican who had followed his party line and not signed up for the Affordable Care Act, or more colloquially known as the Obamacare. And he jeopardized his health when diagnosed with a partially detached retina. So his partisan decision not to sign up for Obamacare literally risked blinding him. Anyway, academics at Berkeley wondered, was Lewis Lang an isolated case, or was polarization affecting the uptake of Obamacare, and would reframing it lead to wider adoption? The short answer was yes. So when they reframed Obamacare as signing up or enrolling into a health insurance website, not a government website, Republicans were more likely to enroll by 20 percentage points. So find the right messenger and frame your messages in a way that appeals to the other side. Okay, that's me. Thank you. Last two key messages really from the book. One is that polarization can be deeply corrosive, from those kitchen table conversations right up to trying to solve global problems like climate change. Second, on a more optimistic note, is because we are all part of the problem, we are therefore also part of the solution. Great. Thank you.
Alex, that's absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
And I can highly recommend the book. Just be careful when you're ordering it, because when I first ordered Poles Apart on Amazon, I ended up with a children's book about an unlikely friendship between a polar bear and a penguin, which seemed both improbable on geographical and biological grounds, to be absolutely honest. But Poles Apart, absolutely fantastic. I've got one question here is interesting. Can you think of societies, if people are perceiving the UK to be very, very polarised, can you think of any nations or societies which are remarkable for their lack of polarisation?
Yeah, great question. So the literature suggests actually Japan as one place that historically has seen very low levels of polarisation. Now, this is on talking about issue polarisation. So right back to that first slide on there's generally two types of polarisation. There's affective, which is more around the kind of groups we belong to, and issue polarisation, which is more around divides around issues. So if we think about polarisation more in that issue-led way, yeah, Japan is one country, and some of the hypotheses around why Japan has seen lower levels of polarisation include, for example, a more it's a cultural phenomena. The fact that they think about others first, and they're much more community-based, so they're much more all of us together, as a collective, rather than us and them.
It's very interesting because someone else has asked a question, which is interesting. Do you think that there's a focus too much on rights and too little on obligations in terms of political discourse? And so Gillian has raised a question about motorists versus cyclists, which is an ironic kind of polarisation because in many cases people are both. And yet where they sit on that particular divide seems to have driven. It never occurred to me to see a bicycle-car divide, in my early youth, for example. And yet that's something that has become a real hot-button divisive issue. What's going on there, do you think?
Yes, an interesting question. So I mean, most of us, I think, don't think at that level. Is it a right or is it an obligation? I think it's more around we think first of who we are. So are we a motorist versus are we a cyclist? And depending on what those norms are within each of those groups, that will then affect how we behave. So I think one of the things we point out in the book is that often I think we think that facts might work, for example, or more information might work to change the other side's mind. So actually, if we inform people about actually motorists have this right, or actually you have this particular obligation, it's unlikely to work. What we've actually maybe should be thinking about is actually what have those two groups got in common, and how can we start from there?
There's a good question here as well. Again, this one from Trier Gvenda, which is when polarisation is based on unchangeable aspects of identity like race, do you think these solutions can still apply? In other words, what you might call the football shirt experiment, can that actually work similarly even if your identity is to some extent not a matter of choice?
Yeah, really good question. So actually, Cass Sunstein describes, this is obviously is in the context of the States, but describes affective polarization as partyism, so a bit like racism or sexism. And some of the effects that I was talking about, those spillover effects, the effects are larger than, for example, religion or race. So there's been various experiments done on the effect of polarization on job hiring decisions, and those effects of someone's political affiliation are larger than, for example, their race. So I think we can. I think some of the potential solutions or ways to reframe can apply. So, for example, um, I'm thinking the way that a lot of companies, for example, approach D&I or diversity and inclusion often highlights what's different about us rather than what we have in common. Now, that's not to say that those differences are absolutely important, they are, but it's just psychologically by drawing attention to what's different between us rather than what's in common, that can exacerbate the divides. I'll tell you a good example. I went to university, my undergrad was in Cardiff. So I said I grew up in Brighton, never thought of a divide between English and Welsh. And Rory, I know you're Welsh. Never thought of a divide between us. And when I got there, my first week in university halls was described as khaki size, which means English, I won't swear, but shit. I was like, whoa, never realised there was this kind of divide before. And it made me it made me quickly realise, wow, this is a divide. But it created that division where there was one, at least for me, that never existed before. So coming back to the question of race, I think something like race clearly needs at that institutional level, protection in regulation to guard against or safeguard against biased decisions. But I think the way that a lot of companies and organisations approach the issue could benefit from some of the psychology, because the underlying psychology, going back to the Cass Sunstein point, between effective polarisation and prejudice against, for example, based on ethnicity, gender, is exactly the same. So yes, some of the same solutions can certainly be used.
Quite well-intentioned things could backfire. There's the famous scene in Derry Girls, apologise to overseas listeners who may not have seen it, where Catholics and Protestants are brought together and they end up just compiling lists of differences to the extent that Protestants keep their toasters in a cupboard and so on. And actually, my friend Dave Snowden did an interesting experiment across the sectarian divide. He took mixed groups of Catholics and Protestants to Latin America, at which point they all absolutely identified as Irish, and the divisions more or less disappeared. So I think there is there's a huge comparative frame question here, and in some of our well-intentioned activities, we may be absolutely emphasising difference rather than similarity, which is a really, really interesting. Well, stay on the line because you've got Rob Henderson coming up later with luxury beliefs. So I'll give a little pre-plug for that. And next, thank you enormously, Alex, and over to another commercial break. A few words from our sponsor. Thank you very much indeed. Just one favour. If you want to keep Nudgestock free, click the like button because the algorithm likes it, and click the subscribe button too. The algorithm likes that, and unlike the like button, it's actually useful, because you'll get notified of future content from Nudgestock whenever it becomes available.